Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new series of meetings on the Finance Network and titled In Conversation, Exploring the Philosophy of Money and Finance. And the series will feature various interviews. And today we are excited to kick off with Asya Passinky, who will be interviewed by Graham Hubbs. And so thank you very much, Asya and Graham, for accepting our invitation. And today's interview is titled Cryptocurrency, Commodity or Credit, with a question mark, and is inspired by a chapter authored by Asya in the recently published book, The Philosophy of Money and Finance for Oxford University Press, edited by Joachim Sandberg and Lisa Varesny. And so before we begin, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to the co-organizers of this series, Joachim Sandberg, and especially Lisa Varesny for making this possible. And after the interview, we will have a debate, and so you can ask your questions raising your virtual hand by clicking on the button at the bottom of the Zoom menu, and we'll manage the queue. So that's all from me for now, and let's begin the interview.
Great. Thank you, Emiliano. My name is Graham Hubbs. I am at the Department of Politics and Philosophy at the University of Idaho, and it is my pleasure today to introduce and to interview my colleague and friend, Asya Passinky. She is currently an assistant professor of philosophy at Central European University in Vienna. She's previously taught at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, at Dartmouth College, and at New York University. She obtained her PhD in philosophy at NYU, her BPhil in philosophy at Oxford, where she was on a Rhodes Scholarship, and her BA in political economy and Slavic languages and literature at the University of California, Berkeley. Her work is primarily in metaphysics, social philosophy, and feminist philosophy. Her current projects include a book on the metaphysics of social objects, such as borders, states, and the topic of today's conversation, money, dollars, and a series of papers on social construction and on grounding and essence. Finally, she is the co-founder and co-organizer of the annual Social Metaphysics Workshop and vice president of the International Social Ontology Society. She was introduced to me by our common friend, David Dick, who passed away tragically a couple of years ago. And so we wanted to acknowledge Dave before we started this off. He brought many of us working in the philosophy of money together. And so Asya and I wanted to do this in memory of Dave. So, all right, Asya, can you get us going by telling us a little bit about how you got into the topic of this paper?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So I want to first say thank you to Graham, to Emiliano, and to Lisa for organizing this. It's really an honor and a pleasure to do the interview. And so on the question of how I got into the topic, so I got into the field of social ontology, which is a subfield of philosophy that studies kind of the general nature of the social world, when I was an undergraduate at Berkeley, studying political economy. So when I was studying politics and economics, I came to realize that a lot of the questions that I was most interested in were really philosophical questions about the nature of the entities that social scientists were studying, as well as some methodological questions. And so that led me in my final year to take a course with John Searle, who's a leading figure in the field. And then I became a research assistant to him, and that kind of jump-started my long interest in the field of social ontology. Now, when it comes to money in particular, so money is oftentimes used as a paradigm example in the social ontology literature. So I already started thinking a bit about money, but really it was Dave, who you already mentioned, who kind of started my serious interest in this new field of the philosophy of money. So I kind of first attended a symposium on the philosophy of money where Dave was presenting a paper at one of the annual meetings of the American Philosophical Association. And I just found the talks, including Dave's, so exciting. And I had a great conversation with Dave afterwards. And then sometime later, he invited me to be part of a panel on the philosophy of money at a meeting of the annual PPE Society. And that was really the beginning of kind of my serious interest in this topic.
Great. Could you tell us a little bit more about how either contemporary metaphysics, broadly construed, or maybe a little bit more narrowly contemporary social ontology informs the study of money, and how investigating money as a topic broadens the horizons of social ontology and contemporary metaphysics?
Yeah. So I'll start with first how thinking about money might really kind of broaden the horizons or make us rethink certain assumptions and theories in social ontology. So I already mentioned Searle, and one very prominent view of the social world that goes back to Searle's work is this idea that the social world is created as a kind of overlay of the material or physical reality. So um, effectively, we create social entities by imposing some social statuses on things in the material or physical world. So for example, we might kind of create a dollar bill by imposing this social status of being money on a particular piece of paper. Now, that sort of view works for a lot of entities, and including some forms of money like dollar bills. But I think that especially when we think about new forms of money like cryptocurrency, we see that this model kind of isn't going to apply in these sort of cases, right? So there doesn't seem to be some physical entity onto which we confer some social status in the case of something like a crypto coin. Already we get this problem with electronic dollars, arguably, but I think that crypto coins kind of really are a very kind of nice example of this that really challenges this sort of general model of the social world.
Great. Can you say then a little bit more about how these ideas work out specifically in the paper that you've written for the volume that kind of is what's bringing us together today?
Yeah. So maybe I'll return to kind of the other direction because that will be very, very relevant to the paper. So a lot of my training has been not just in social ontology, but in the field of contemporary analytic metaphysics, which very broadly studies the general nature and structure of reality. And one of the questions that metaphysicians have kind of thought long and hard about since the time of Aristotle is the nature of ordinary material things. So things like tables and chairs, and the metaphysician's favorite is usually statues, right? And so the question that metaphysicians have thought a lot about is, well, what is a statue? Is it, say, just the clay that makes it up, or is it something over and above just that clay? And then they've developed different kind of theories and views in response to that question. And so I think that if we look at that literature, we can take some of these theories that have been developed and apply them to the case of money and to social objects generally. So that's kind of one of the things that I've done in a lot of my work and in my book project, and also in this paper. And so in particular, I'm interested in neo-Aristotelian views, hylomorphic views, where the basic idea of hylomorphism is that we can understand an object as, in some sense, a compound of matter and form. Right, so to take a very simple example, an H2O molecule might be construed as a compound of these three atoms, the two hydrogen atoms, and the oxygen atom, and a certain arrangement of these atoms, something like being chemically bonded in the appropriate way. And then that molecule then would be this composite object, which includes as part of its identity both these kind of physical atoms and that arrangement. And then the idea is that, well, we can take this idea from the metaphysics literature and apply this to kind of social entities, including things like dollar bills and crypto coins, right? And the basic idea is that, well, tokens of money like a dollar bill or a crypto coin also can be construed as this compound of a matter and a form, where the matter might be something physical, like in the case of a dollar bill, it might be just a piece of paper, right? But it also might be something immaterial or abstract, like bits or blocks of data in the case of a crypto coin. And then the form I want to suggest is a relational normative property that involves a claim on or credit with some individual or entity. And that's an idea that I take from the credit theory of money. And so that's the kind of basic view of money that I propose in the chapter.
Okay, great. So you just mentioned that the notion of form that you think applies to thinking through money has got this normative element, and that you take from the tradition of the credit or chartalist view of thinking about money. Is it fair to say that when you're thinking about the matter, that the tradition that is commonly known as the commodity account, or the commodity theory of money, gives us a better account of the matter? Is that a way that you're putting form and matter together? Is like the commodity theory and the credit theory?
So somewhat.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So I think that the matter can be a commodity. And so in that sense, I think that I am drawing on the commodity theory. So I take it that the commodity theorist, I mean, there's many different ways in which the commodity theory can be interpreted, but the way that I interpret their ontological claim is that, a token of money, like a dollar bill, just is a commodity, where a commodity is a physical thing. Now, on my account, I want to say, well, first of all, the dollar bill is not just a commodity, even in the case of something like seashell money, because it has this additional thing, the form, which I take to be the credit or the claim. So there's something else in addition to a commodity. But also, I want to say that in some cases, the matter is not going to be a commodity, right? So it might be something like bits or blocks of data, which I think is not kind of in any sense of commodity, a commodity. So there's two kind of ways in which I depart, I think, from the commodity ontology. So first, I add on this form, which is this credit or claim. And so that's where I'm drawing on the credit theory. And second, I want to move beyond just commodities as being things that might play the role of matter, and say that, look, other sort of immaterial or abstract objects that are maybe part of the virtual or digital world can also play that role.
Great. And on the form side, it sounds like you're not thinking of form exclusively as the structural features of something, in the way that the example of the statue encourages one to think about form. So could you say a little bit more about what you take forms in general to be, not just as applied to money, but for all kinds of social objects? And if the example, thinking about the example of money, helps us to have a broader conception of form that we might otherwise have?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. So yeah, I think if we think about the kind of example of the H2O molecule, the form is like this physical arrangement, right? And then in the case of something like a statue, it seems even more like, oh, it's literally maybe a certain shape. Though I think a lot of theorists would deny that, but that's at least one kind of prima facie way in which we might construe the form of the statue. And I want to move away from that and say that, at least in the case of social objects, including things like money, but also borders and states and governments and corporations, the form is not going to be this kind of physical or material arrangement, but rather it's going to be something that's essentially normative. So some normative relation where I construe normativity very broadly to include things like legal rights and obligations, or kind of social norms, practices, or also moral obligations or duties. And so which of those it will be in any given case will depend on the specific case, right? So in the case of something like a US $1 bill, I think that the form is plausibly something like the relational normative property of being such that the bearer of that bill has a credit, a legal credit of $1 with the US government, right? So they have a kind of legal right to, say, use that piece of paper to cancel some of their tax debt to the government, or tax obligation to the government, right? And so, yeah, I think that in thinking about objects like money and social objects more generally, I think that leads us to kind of see that a conception of form that limits form to some kind of physical or material arrangement is going to be impoverished if we really want to account for objects in the social world.
Great. Emiliano, do I have time for one more question? Great. Yeah, okay, so just as a wrap-up question to segue into Q&A, Asya, I wanted to know what challenges you found on working on this particular project.
Yeah, so I think the challenges have been ones that we've really discussed with you a lot, and that we've both found challenging. So one kind of specific challenge is just figuring out what the credit and commodity theories say. So there's a huge literature on these theories, and it just takes an enormous amount of work to even try to kind of figure out what the claims of these theories are. But a more kind of basic general challenge is that so many people from so many different fields and traditions have written on this question of, what is money, or what is the nature of money, right? So philosophers, including social ontologists, also sociologists, also economists and political scientists. And so you really get all these literatures from these different fields and traditions using their own terminologies and their own frameworks. And I think that for me, as someone who really has training in analytic metaphysics and social ontology primarily, it was really a challenge kind of getting into this whole literature. And Graham, you were incredibly helpful with helping me navigate it. But I think that was a very, very big challenge, in part because I think the way that academia is these days, we tend to really specialize on a kind of rather narrow area and really become experts on a certain field. And it's really not so easy to go beyond that and, read all these different literatures and try to synthesize ideas from so many different fields. But I think that's ultimately also one of the things that I found most rewarding working on this topic.
Great. Well, I could ask many more questions about form. So if we don't have any audience questions, that's where I'm going to take things. But I think this is a good time to segue into seeing what the audience wants to ask Asya.
Great. Thank you, Graham.
Thank you.
So yes, thank you very much again, Asya and Graham, for this insightful interview. We can now open the debate. Already see hands raised by Simon Irwin.
Thank you. So I actually want to ask something about forms, so maybe Graham will find that of interest too. So the form, in the case of a dollar bill, you said at least partly consists of various normative properties. And I'm wondering what the norms are directed at, because at some point you said that they're norms governing the dollar bill, but then after that you said norms that allow you to use this piece of paper to pay off a debt, where the piece of paper isn't the bill, it's the matter of the bill. So if the norms are directed at the dollar bill itself, then the norms that constitute partly the dollar bill refer to the bill that they help to constitute. So there's a possible problem about well-foundedness or something there. I don't know if it's a real problem or not, but I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. So do the norms specifically apply to the dollar bill or the piece of paper that constitutes the dollar bill? So I should maybe just clarify. So on my view, because the dollar bill is this compound of matter and form, it's not going to be identical to the piece of paper. So I adopt what's called a kind of two-thinger or many-thinger approach, where the dollar bill is a distinct object from the piece of paper. Now, I think that plausibly the norms do apply to the dollar bill, but that the piece of paper inherits those norms as well. So I think that's probably what I would want to say. Now, is there a problem with well-foundedness? I mean, yeah, there does seem to be some sort of kind of circularity there if the norm kind of applies, at least in the first instance, to the dollar bill. I'm not sure that it's a problematic sort of circularity, but I know that you've thought about this a lot. So yeah, I think my answer would be that I see that there's a circularity. I'm not convinced that it's problematic. And I think that the piece of paper arguably inherits that property from the dollar bill.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you both for your question answer. Now a question coming from Galit Wellner. So thank you, Galit, for joining us. You are muted.
Thank you so much. It was fascinating, and I'm very happy to be in this forum. These are questions that I've been struggling with, but as you said, it's a multidisciplinary area. So I came up from philosophy of technology, of all things. And so I have this class on fintech technologies and cryptocurrencies, and I would like to take you to the cryptocurrency questions. And what I'm struggling there with is the kind of it's not even normative aspects, it's the regulatory aspects. Mm-hmm. Like with your perspective, I'm so curious to hear, what do you think, who should regulate cryptocurrencies? If I can summarize it into one little bit of question.
Yeah, good. So, I mean, this paper was more on kind of the metaphysics of money and cryptocurrency. So I don't really get into the regulatory questions. So I did write an earlier paper called Should Bitcoin Be Classified as Money? And that gets a bit more into regulatory issues, though it doesn't entirely address your question. But there I kind of start with this observation that there have been these problems for regulators. So for example, the IRS in the US, the tax agency, had to decide whether to kind of take Bitcoin to be money for tax purposes, right? So that's a regulatory agency, and now they have this question like, how do we classify Bitcoin? Is it money? Is it not money? And how they answer that is going to have huge impacts on people, right? You know, people's taxes might go way up if they make the one decision as opposed to the other. And, you know, similarly, there have been these court cases where, you know, someone has been convicted of defrauding other people using Bitcoin. And then the question comes up for the judge, well, is Bitcoin actually money? Because the defrauding regulations and laws only apply to money, right? And so in that paper, I sketched kind of two ways in which we might approach this question. One would be a descriptive way where we say, well, you know, we should really, as philosophers, figure out what money is, and then we should think about whether Bitcoin satisfies the conditions for being money. And then that's how we answer these kind of regulatory and legal questions. But I think a different approach would be to say, look, for these purposes, it doesn't really matter what money is. Rather, we should think about kind of which way of classifying it would make the most sense given kind of the aims and purposes of our laws and regulations. And that I call a normative approach. So we don't kind of try to figure out this fact of the matter. Rather, we think about, well, what would be kind of most useful given the purposes of our laws and regulations? And that's ultimately where I land. And so I think that, you know, when, you know, you asked who should regulate this, I think also in response to that question, we should think about, well, you know, what are our aims and purposes in regulating money, right? So for instance, we want to make sure that people pay taxes on income that they get. We want to make sure that people aren't defrauding other people. And so I think we need to start with those aims and then think about how those aims are best, you know, implemented. And I don't have kind of specific answers on those questions. I think that's a very big project and an important one.
May I ask a follow-up to that?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Graham.
Great, thank you. So Asya, what your answer made me think about, makes me want to ask you, on your view, can a single object have more than one form? And here's what I'm thinking. You might think that Bitcoin is used in a certain way by those who have it and trade it, and that's norm governed too, but the norms that govern or that an outsider might apply to explain its use may not match up with the legal norms that, you know, a jurisdiction is trying to implement on top of it. So you might have like a legal form that a government or a regulatory agency is trying to impose upon the thing, but you might have a different kind of norms in practice form about how people are using it. Is there any problem on your view about, well, first off, would you be comfortable with saying that social kinds or social objects like money could have multiple forms? And if so, are there any tensions in thinking about things having multiple forms at one time?
Yeah, cool. So I think I would want to say that any given object or kind of object can only have one form. Now that form can involve multiple normative properties and relations, so it can be a kind of conjunctive thing, but I don't think it can have more than one form. And the reason is that I think that the existence conditions for a given social kind will be fixed and determined by that form. So if there's kind of multiple distinct forms, then we wouldn't have an answer to the question of, well, when does a dollar bill exist? Right? So I want to say, well, a dollar bill exists when there's a suitable kind of constituting object, like a piece of paper, and it has this relevant relational normative property, namely being such that the bearer has a credit of $1 with the US government. But if there were multiple forms, then we wouldn't be able to answer that question of under what conditions does a dollar bill exist. So I think that's why I want to say there's only one form, though it can be conjunctive. Now, in the really interesting case that you just mentioned, I think what's going on is that if there are kind of further legal rules, laws, regulations that are being imposed, those aren't part of the form. So they're not going to be part of the nature or identity of what that kind of crypto coin is. but they will still kind of govern crypto coins, and they might be very important, but they won't be part of what that thing is, right? So, I mean, here's an analogy. So, there's a big question of if you're a hylomorphist, what is the form of a human being? But, some people have thought the form is something like a soul, right? But there are also all kinds of laws and regulations governing human beings, like human rights law, for example. But I don't think that human rights law is part of our form, even though it's something that's specifically designed to, apply all and only to, say, human beings, and it's a legal thing.
Thank you, Asa. Thank you, Graham. I don't know if there are other questions. Otherwise, I have a question, but of course, I don't see other questions coming from the audience. Yes, so I will ask my question. So thank you, Asa, again for your thoughtful talk. And I was thinking about your notion of form. Would you say that the different kinds of cryptocurrencies, I'm thinking of, for instance, Bitcoins, one kind of cryptocurrency, a stable coin, it's another slightly different way of implementing currencies. And then we have also the digital EU or digital dollars, which are even a different way of, because they depend on central banks. And so it's another, so do you think, would you say that they have different forms or what else?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I'm not sure what I want to say. So I definitely want to say that they're different, so there has to be something that distinguishes them. So on my view, there would be two options, or really three, to say, well, what distinguishes them is the matter, right? So maybe the matter is different because the sort of blocks of data or bits of data that are the matter of Bitcoins is going to be different from the kind of stuff that's going to be the matter of these other coins. Or I could say that the form is different. Now, I was thinking that the form in the case of Bitcoin is something like being such that the user, the bearer, has a credit of, say, 1 Bitcoin with other members of the Bitcoin community. So I could say that, yeah, in the case of these other currencies, cryptocurrencies, the form is different because that credit or claim would be with other members of that relevant community of users. So that could be something that I could point to as a difference. But also, I think it might be plausible that the matter is different. And so that's the third option, to say, well, what distinguishes them is both the matter and the form. So the form will be different because the relevant community of users will be different, to whom that kind of obligation, as it were, applies, to say, accept the thing in exchange, as payment for goods and services. But also the matter might be different insofar as the kind of blocks of data that play the role of matter will be different.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your answer. And I don't know if I don't see other questions. Maybe I can ask just a last question. It's a follow-up of your answer, and that's very interesting. And I was thinking if you can, I mean, derive different functions from different forms, in the sense that many people analyzing cryptocurrency says that they are not different kind of money, in the sense, for instance, Bitcoin isn't a currency in the same sense of a stable coin, because you can see more Bitcoin as a speculative asset more than a currency, because the variation of the price is too erratic to be considered as a currency, while stable coins are much more stable by definition, even more, of course, the digital EU and the digital dollar. So they seem to have different functions of money. And so you can build a portfolio, for instance, with different kind of cryptocurrencies, and it depends on your goals, of course. And so I was thinking, if your notion of form implies also different notions of functions for the money, for the currency.
I see. Yeah, that's really interesting. So, I mean, I guess insofar as the notion of a form makes reference to a certain community, in some sense, the function will be different because the function will be kind of relative to that community, one might say. Now, I'm not sure how to think through the relation with the volatility, right? So I'm not sure that what makes Bitcoin volatile is the specific community of users, though maybe it is, right? So if the community of users involves a lot of people who are, say, using the money for nefarious means, then maybe that's part of the reason that it's so volatile. But yeah, I think I would have to kind of think a lot more about what is the root of the volatility, right? Because it's the volatility that you mentioned as something that some people think makes Bitcoin more of a speculative investment than money. And so, yeah, if the root of the volatility has something to do with kind of the community of specific Bitcoin users as opposed to the community of stablecoin users, then I think I could point to the form. But that's a really, really interesting question. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Asa, for your answer and your. I mean, it's a very interesting project, and good luck with it. So, yeah, I don't see other questions coming from the audience, and so I think we could stop here. Thanking again Asa and Graham for this beautiful interview, and I hope to see you on the next in conversation.